Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Anthony Gonzalez and I'm the program coordinator for the Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse Prevention and Recovery. I'm going to welcome you all to our webinar titled From Proposals to Programming, a how-to guide for writing effective learning outcomes, featuring our very own Dr. Molly Downing. Before we dive into today's content, I do just have a couple of housekeeping slides I'd like to review with everybody. Here on the screen should look somewhat familiar as we are in the Zoom webinar format. We do have the chat enabled today, so please feel free to introduce yourself and share where you're joining us from. We'll also have a few chances to engage with one another via the chat later on in today's session. If you have questions for our presenter for today, please utilize the Q&A feature just so we don't miss those. And additionally, we have captioning enabled and you can turn that on through your bottom dashboard. We also encourage everybody to learn more about becoming a member of the Higher Education Center. You can learn more about the different memberships and the benefits that go along with the tiers by visiting our website at hecaod.osu.edu. We also have a couple of upcoming events. We have the national meeting happening in just a few days at the end of June, the 25th through the 28th, and it will be taking place here in Columbus, Ohio. We also have virtual options for those who can't join us in person. We also have a July webinar scheduled for July 23rd, and it's titled Screen You on Campus, and is featuring our very own Logan Davis and Amy Howergan from the University of South Carolina. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce you today, our presenter, Dr. Molly Downing. Dr. Downing is the Assistant Director of Generation RX, is the faculty liaison for the Higher Education Center, and is an Ohio State faculty member in the College of Pharmacy. It's my pleasure turning it over to you at this time.
Thank you, Anthony. Can everyone hear me okay? Hopefully. We will go ahead and get started. So let me just pull up my slides. So as Anthony mentioned, my name is Molly Downing, and I will be with you for the next hour as we discuss how to write effective learning outcomes. So these are our learning outcomes about our webinar around learning outcomes. We have 4 today, so these are my goals for you, that by the end of today's session, that you're able to first explain the role learning outcomes play in creating meaningful learning experiences, list guiding principles that support writing effective learning outcomes and locate resources for doing so, and then be able to apply the guiding principles to revise learning outcomes for all the various educational initiatives that you all are involved with. We have a few opportunities for engagement today. Feel free to engage at the level that you were the most comfortable with. So as Anthony mentioned, if you have a question at any time, you can drop it in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And Anthony, feel free to interrupt me if a question comes in and you think it would be more useful for me to answer it throughout the webinar. We also have some practice opportunities and some different exercises just to engage with the material today. As I kind of share those opportunities, feel free to respond in the chat thread where you can share your thoughts with your colleagues, or feel free to just engage in self-reflection and just internalize those thoughts for yourself. Whatever you're the most comfortable with is fine with me. Let me start by just sharing a little bit about my connection to this topic, because I know it's a bit of a different topic for our HECAOD community to engage with. And then I'd love to hear a little bit more from you and what makes you interested in this particular topic. So I love learning outcomes, and we're going to abbreviate learning outcomes as LOs today. And as Anthony mentioned, I wear a few different hats as a faculty member in the College of Pharmacy at Ohio State. 2 of those hats include serving as the Assistant Director for Generation RX, and then I help support the partnership between the College of Pharmacy and HECAOD. And it's in these roles that I've had the opportunity to design and develop a few different learning experiences. And that has ranged from didactic courses for undergraduates to educational resources for Generation RX or professional training programs for HECAOD. But I do not have any necessarily like formal training in this particular field. So my formal training is as a pharmacologist, so in the basic sciences. But I've had the opportunity at Ohio State to engage in a lot of professional development workshops to really learn best practices around learning design. And it's through these workshops and through these learning design kind of projects that I've engaged with over the last 10 years or so, that I've developed a deep respect and appreciation and love for learning outcomes. So today I'm going to share some of what I've learned over the last 10 years or so with you all. So now I'd like to learn a little bit about what makes you interested in this topic, but what brings you to the webinar today. And Anthony is going to launch our first polling question. And it's a select all that apply. So fill in the blank to this sentence. I recognize learning outcomes are important, but I would love more support with blank. So again, you can select all that apply. And Anthony, feel free to close that poll when you think we have most folks submit their response.
We still have responses coming in. I'll close it in about 5 seconds.
Okay. All right, so it looks like we have some folks interested in understanding the role learning outcomes play in teaching and learning, but that's a much smaller percentage compared to identifying the process for writing drafts of learning outcomes and then revising those outcomes, those drafted outcomes with evidence-based principles. So this is a lovely breakdown because it really kind of helps set up the roadmap for our conversation today. So in that roadmap, we are going to begin by thinking of how learning outcomes support meaningful learning experiences, but we're just going to spend a few minutes on that particular topic. So for those that really want to deep dive into that conversation, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to talk further if you feel like I didn't really answer this question today. But most of us are here because we want access or maybe a little bit of information around this how-to guide that I promised you based upon the webinar title. So I'm going to give you that today. And we're going to actually work through it with those examples and practice opportunities. So that's where we're headed over the next hour. But let's first begin by thinking of how learning outcomes support meaningful learning experiences. And to tee up this question, we're going to use my daughter, Emma, to help us explore this question, okay? So I'm going to share this scenario and ask you to submit some thoughts in the chat, and that's going to help us, again, answer that question. So Emma turned 5 at the beginning of May, and May marked a big month in Emma's life. She graduated from preschool, but she also was able to attend an open house at her elementary school where she's going to attend kindergarten. And as soon as we walked into the elementary school, the administrative leaders handed me this sheet of paper of everything that Emma should be able to do by her first day of kindergarten, okay? So if you wanna play along, what do you think I found on that sheet? What do you think are examples of things 5-year-olds should be able to do on their first day of kindergarten? And I'll get us started. One of the things was that she needed to be able to state her home address, which she cannot do. So that's something for us to work on this summer. I can see, yeah, identify shapes, write her name, know the alphabet. Yeah, put on and take off her jacket. Perfect. So you all, as you look at this chat thread, these are really outcomes, right? But they're outcomes or learning outcomes really for a preschool curriculum, okay? Because these are things that she should be able to do on the first day of kindergarten or by the end of preschool, all right? So let's think about this. When should the elementary school share those outcomes? Everything you just listed, when should they share those outcomes with Emma's preschool? Do you think it's option A, which is when she's 3 before preschool even starts? So they're going to give the preschool teachers those outcomes before she starts preschool? Or do you think it should be at the end of preschool at 5, like on graduation day, kind of serving as a checklist? Yeah, so if you look at the chat thread, I see it's an overwhelming A, right? Option A, I completely agree. And why is this? Well, outcomes, learning outcomes, the most basic definition is that they are a statement that articulates what learners should be able to do at the end of a learning experience, okay? And so this basic definition sets up this model that we use in education called backward design. Now, some of you may be familiar with this model. It was really developed and been utilized quite readily over the last 20 years or so. And there's a very rich body of evidence that when we use backward design principles to design our learning experiences, we really see positive learning experiences being created that help learners achieve those end goals that we have for them. And backward design principles start with learning outcomes. Okay, so the graphic on the right is an example of how some folks like to visualize this process of backward design principles. And I'll walk us through it using an example of a didactic course. So a course that I might design for undergraduate students, for example. So if we can start with developing learning outcomes, we start with that end goal. This helps us think about the impact that we want the course to have on the student when the course ends. Okay, just like what do we want Emma to be able to do at the end of preschool or the start of kindergarten? And then what we can do is the next step is we can identify measures that help determine if students achieve those end goals. So how will we know if students have achieved the end goals we created for them? Well, we want to develop assessments like maybe quizzes or final projects or tests or weekly discussions, right? And then the last step is you plan learning activities and content to support students successfully completing those assessments and thereby achieving those learning outcomes. So the reason why it's called backward design is because oftentimes it's intuitive to start with our learning activities and content. But if we do that, we may not get to the end goal, right? If we do so, it often is just like a serendipitous, discovery. But intentional learning design starts with learning outcomes, all right? And so when you think about the role that learning outcomes play in designing meaningful learning experiences, because they reflect the end goal or the desired impact, if we develop them first, it often provides this very clear roadmap for designing the rest of the learning experience with intention and purpose. So it gives clarity to those evaluation measures that we should be developing. It gives clarity to the learning activities and the content that we should be developing as well, okay? Just like in the example with Emma's preschool, we want those outcomes to be with those preschool teachers at the start of her preschool experience so they can design the preschool experience around Emma achieving those end goals by the end of preschool. And so while we're not necessarily in the work we're doing, we're not necessarily designing preschool curriculums or didactic 16-week courses, but we are designing lots of different kinds of educational experiences. And I've listed a couple of examples here, and there might be others that you can relate to. But I know when we submit conference session proposals, we need strong learning outcomes. Grants or other funding mechanisms, professional trainings and workshops, whether that's for peer educators or colleagues, or other educational initiatives. So you might develop educational programming, right, to support the students on your campus. And all of these learning experiences, starting with those learning outcomes or those end goals, are going to give you a really clear roadmap for designing a meaningful learning experience that helps your learner achieve those end goals. Okay, so that's my 5-minute spiel on the role learning outcomes play in creating meaningful learning experiences. If you want to dive deeper into that question, again, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to connect with you via Zoom to talk further. But I'd like to now kind of pivot to this how-to guide. Okay, so we recognize that learning outcomes play a really important role in designing a learning experience, but how do we write effective learning outcomes? So let's now kind of pivot to introducing you to this how-to guide. And as we work through the how-to guide, we're going to do so through some examples and some practice opportunities. So before I introduce you to the how-to guide, I want to get your thoughts on another question. And if you want to participate, you can do so by just sharing your thoughts in the chat. So the question is, in your experience, what single word best completes this sentence? Effective learning outcomes are blank. So if you had to use one word to describe an effective learning outcome, what word would you choose? So I see realistic, clear, smart. So Christine knows what SMART stands for here. Succinct, measurable, achievable, measurable, attainable, perfect. So these are excellent characteristics to describe effective learning outcomes, okay? Unfortunately, in order for us to have a measurable learning outcome, an attainable one, something specific, something achievable, there's often a process involved for writing those learning outcomes with those particular characteristics. And that process is what I want to kind of introduce you to at this time. And we're going to use most of our conversation today to work through it. So the process that I have learned over the last 10 years or so for writing effective learning outcomes really consists of 3 steps, okay? Identify situational factors, brainstorm big ideas and essential questions that help write the first draft of learning outcomes, and then apply additional guiding principles to revise and rewrite those drafted learning outcomes, all right? So this how-to guide, we have in the chat access to a PDF copy of this how-to guide. So Logan just dropped that in the chat. At the end of the webinar, I'm going to drop in the chat the editable form of this guide in case you want to complete it with a future project. Also, in the upcoming slides, we are going to work through a case study, an example case study, so that I can introduce you to this process and to the different steps. And as we work through each step, I'm going to populate this guide with some examples. At the end of the webinar, I'll drop the completed example how-to guide in the chat thread. So don't feel like you have to write down everything you see in the slide if something kind of speaks to you, okay? All right, so let's get started. The information in this guide is taken from a few different evidence-based resources. Those resources are also in the guide as well. So we're going to start with step 1, which is identifying situational factors. Oh, nope, I lied. Sorry, I'm going to introduce you to our case study, and then we'll move to step 1. Okay, so the example we're going to put forth to help us populate the how-to guide to serve as an example is the following. So you decide that you want to submit a session proposal for HECIOD's national meeting, and you need to draft a set of learning outcomes for the proposal, okay? So again, that learning experience is a conference session. I picked HECIOD's national meeting here because I know that we can all relate to maybe wanting to draft a session proposal for that particular meeting. So I'm going to tee up an example of the work that you've been doing over the last year, and I'm going to be a little vague here, so hopefully it's enough detail to help you understand how we populate the how-to guide. But the summary of the work that you've been up to is you utilize the strategic prevention framework to conduct a needs assessment on campus and identified rising concerns and problems associated with fentanyl. You opted to enhance capacity by partnering with colleagues in student wellness, local harm reduction organizations, and the College of Public Health on campus to help you address this problem. And you all work together to plan and implement both naloxone and fentanyl test strip trainings, education, and distribution programs. And then you created an awareness campaign to kind of share these resources and these training opportunities with your campus community. And then you also evaluated these efforts, okay? So we all kind of want to put on a harm reduction hat as we kind of work through this case study, but this is the example scenario that we're going to work through to draft and revise a set of learning outcomes. So if you want to follow along, feel free to access that how-to guide, that PDF, have it up, and that way you can kind of see where we're going, because I'm just taking screen grabs of those sections, and that's what you're going to see on this particular slide, okay? So if you have the PDF up, you'll recognize that the first step is to identify situational factors. So there are factors surrounding the learning experience that we want to be aware of. And those factors often fall into 3 categories: logistics, expectations of external groups, and then characteristics of your learner. So in this step, you're really just jotting down and collecting information about those 3 areas. And what's going to happen is when we get to the very end of our process, where we're revising our learning outcomes, one of the guiding principles is to check for alignment. Check that the learning outcomes that you've drafted aligned with the logistics, the expectations, and the characteristics of the learner. And so that will make a little bit more sense in a few minutes. But for now, I'll just show you how you can populate these situational factors. So if we start with logistics, again, we're thinking of the national meeting, okay? So what are the logistics regarding length of time and setting? Well, it's a 1-hour conference session. That's particularly important for us to note. It's in person. And I think it's useful to think about the size of your audience, right? So can you do something that's a little bit more interactive, or are you going to be mostly at a podium and being lecture style? That can really shape the learning outcomes that you draft. So the learners in this experience, typically we have 25 to 50 in a room. Next, we want to think about the expectations of external groups or stakeholders. So there's 3 questions that I would encourage you to think through. The first are goals that of those key stakeholders that could affect the learning experience. That's not as relevant, I think, for this setting, but if you were submitting a grant proposal, for example, that would certainly be important to note, right? What are those goals that maybe the funder has for me? Another question that you can think about in this part of the process are professional accreditation requirements. So if you're developing a training that needs to meet CE credit, what does that look like, right? What are those requirements that might impact the learning outcomes of this learning experience? And then the last one is one that we can populate for this example, because if the setting is a conference, what's the theme? What are the overarching goals of the conference? So I know from personal experience, having looked at session proposals for HEC-AOD's national meeting, when I'm scoring them, there is a section where I check for alignment. Do the learning outcomes and the purpose or the goals of this particular session align with the conference theme? So again, just noting that information down, what is the theme? What are the topics that they're accepting proposals around can help us ensure that we are crafting a session that has learning outcomes that align with those expectations of our stakeholders. The last thing that I would encourage you to note at this stage in the process is the characteristics of the learner, okay? So who is your audience? What is their prior experience, knowledge, skill set with the topics that you're thinking of for your session? And what is their current life situation, all right? So the audience in this particular case is you all, right? Professionals working in the collegiate AOD space. In terms of prior experiences, that can vary. We could have someone that has a strong expertise in harm reduction. We could have someone that is just beginning to explore that particular topic. We might also recognize that there's new professionals to veteran leaders. So again, because of that heterogeneous population, when you're thinking of your learning outcomes, it may be useful to acknowledge that breadth in your learning outcomes, okay? Similar with life situation. So if our audience wears multiple hats, and you all do, right? We want to be mindful of that. So if we're sharing the work that I've been doing on campus, and it's required me to use substantial resources, I might want to acknowledge that as a limitation and think about drafting learning outcomes that are relevant then for my audience. Okay, so that's step 1. And again, at this point, you're collecting just some basic information around your learning experience, and we'll come back to how we use it towards step 3. If there's any questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A session, but I'll move on to step 2. So step 2, this is where we really start the process of drafting the first set of learning outcomes. And step 2, we're brainstorming big ideas and essential questions. So if you are working as part of a team to develop a set of learning outcomes, one thing that you can do is that you can create an anonymous survey that has the 6 questions within step 2, put it in that survey and ask your team to answer those questions. That will allow you to kind of look at different perspectives and use that information to kind of help you guide your thoughts as you draft your first set of learning outcomes. So that's something that you can consider doing. I've done it before, and it's been really useful and helpful. So let me introduce you to these 6 questions that are going to lead to drafting the first set of learning outcomes. And when I was first introduced to this process, it was a life-changing experience because before being introduced to this particular step, I feel like I just stared at a piece of paper, right? And just like hoped some magical life-changing thought would pop in my brain. So as a scientist, I really like structure. And so I really liked having this step-by-step process. So hopefully you find some part of it useful. But the first step that I was introduced to is to populate a table. So when I give you the editable form of this resource, you will see this table. It's going to be blank, and you can populate it yourself. But this table contains big ideas and major topics of the learning experience. So if you are thinking of the learning experience you want to provide these learners based upon the work that you're doing, what are those 1 or 2 word phrases that come to mind that you think of? So harm reduction, SPIF, admin buy-in, naloxone, new partnerships, okay? Really big picture ideas. And this is just to start that brainstorm process. Once you have these big ideas jotted in the table, again, you're starting to think of the major topics, right? Now we want to pivot from major topics to essential questions. And in step 2 or question 2, you're basically taking on the role of the learner. And you want to consider when they're sitting there in your session, what are the questions that you want them to be thinking about? What are the tensions? What are those tension points that they're going to be like, oh, I didn't know that. Well, what about this, right? Start to kind of think through that. So for example, they might sit there and say, well, what does effective harm reduction look like? Why is it important? Who are the key stakeholders? And how do I communicate with campus and community partners to build support for this work, right? What does an action plan for successful implementation of a harm reduction strategy look like? How did you all do this work, right? How did you all get buy-in and actually move through that implementation process? And how did you evaluate that effort? So again, at this point in the example I'm giving you, we could have come up with 30 different essential questions. So again, I'm just giving you some examples, and this will be impacted based upon your own unique work. But the idea is just to put yourself in the role of the learner and think about those questions that you want them to be thinking about. And where that will lead you to is the end of the learning experience. So again, you're back in the role of the learner. Your session has ended. They leave the session, and this happens to all of us, right? We meet up with a colleague, we are introduced to a new colleague, and they say, what session did you attend? What did they talk about? What did you learn? And you share, right? And you share in 2 to 3 minutes. What do you want them to say in that 2 to 3 minutes? What do you want them to have learned in that hour that was so impactful that they shared it with a colleague? All right. And if you look at what I wrote down, obviously this isn't enough content for 2 minutes, but just to get us thinking, I noted, I learned how a campus utilized SPIF to address a problem related to harms associated with fentanyl. I'm going to discuss with colleagues if their model could be adapted to address some of our local campus needs. And again, you could elaborate on that summary, but the idea is that we're starting to think of those end goals, okay? And that leads us to question 4. What do you want learners to retain in the short and the long term? Or what impact do you want the learning experience to have, both immediately and long term? So when you think of the immediate impact on the learner, that might look very similar to question 3, okay? And that is similar to what you see I kind of wrote down here of the session provided this model that might help them make their next step wherever they're at in that strategic prevention planning process. But long term, the impact is that, the work that you're all doing, that they can adapt it in some way to help lower harms associated with fentanyl in their campus, but also the work that you did to develop and cultivate new partnerships. Maybe they can do that too. And that helps to create this campus environment that supports harm reduction efforts long term. okay? So again, you'll have your own immediate and long-term goals, but just start to think about that. Think about that immediate and long-term impact that you want to have on the learner. Okay, so we've entered the last two parts of step 2. And the next part, which is kind of part 5, you're going to begin to reflect on your responses to questions 1 and 4. And you want to start to think about, are there natural overlapping themes that emerge? If so, see if the themes naturally sort themselves into 3 to 5 groups, okay? So look at your responses. And when I did that for this example, I came up with 4 themes, all right? So I saw a theme around strategic prevention framework. I saw a theme around foundations of harm reduction, a theme around developing sustainable partnerships, and implementation and evaluation, okay? What you're going to do at this point, so this is where the draft comes in, is for each of those themes that you have noticed based upon your responses to the first 4 questions, you're going to draft a learning outcome that captures what you want the learner to do based on that theme. And I would strongly encourage you, when you go into draft mode, pretend like you're completing this sentence, okay? After participating in this learning experience, conference participants should be able to blank. So always use that sentence to help you draft that first set of learning outcomes, and you'll just change out conference participants to whatever learner you're engaging, all right? So when I tried to complete this sentence, and I looked at the themes that I wrote down for 5, and I reflected on the language that I used in questions 1 through 4. Again, go back and see, how did you describe these themes, right? These are the 3 learning outcomes that I drafted. And I think it's really important to recognize that this is a first draft. So give yourself grace, recognize that it may not be the prettiest or most polished or most perfect learning outcome that anyone's ever seen. It doesn't have to, right? It's a first draft. That's why there's a next step and a last step to revise these drafted learning outcomes into a polished form that you would then submit. So my first attempt was to say, understand key principles of effective harm reduction for campus communities. So I pulled that from that theme of foundations of harm reduction. When I reflected on the theme of developing sustainable partnerships, and I looked at the language that I had used to kind of describe that theme, I came up with know how to develop partnerships with key stakeholders that help build support for campus harm reduction initiatives. And then the last outcome was looking at the other 2 themes, and I could have drafted 2 different learning outcomes, but I kind of combined them. And I came up with use the strategic prevention framework to develop an action plan for implementing harm reduction strategies on your campus. So again, you'll come up with your own set of learning outcomes. And if you take this example, you might come up with something different, right? So this is really just an opportunity for you to reflect on what are those end goals for the learner of your session. All right, any questions at this point? I'm going to check the chat thread real quick. Okay. So far what we've done is we're working through the how-to guide, right? We have identified our situational factors. We're going to come back to those in just a minute. And we've completed step 2. We've brainstormed big ideas and essential questions that help us write a first draft of learning outcomes. But there's one step left, and that step is to apply some additional guiding principles to revise and rewrite the drafted learning outcome. So these guiding principles are going to help ensure that the learning outcomes we just drafted embody the characteristics that you all told me effective learning outcomes are in the chat, okay? So we're going to do this part of our, or engage in this part of the conversation through some examples and practice opportunities. So again, if you want to participate, you can do so by sharing your thoughts in the chat, or you can just internalize those thoughts and just engage in self-reflection. So let me introduce you to some additional guiding principles that we're going to use to revise and rewrite those 3 learning outcomes we just drafted, all right? And as I introduce these principles, I'll also introduce some resources to you. So if you asked me, you know, what's one word that you would use to describe an effective learning outcome? I've actually come up with 5 words, and many of them are exactly what you all told me in the chat thread. So the first 2 words that I would come up with are measurable and specific. So those are our first 2 guiding principles. And when you look at this section of the handout, you can see that I've kind of elaborated on what I mean by measurable and specific. And I've also identified some resources for helping us. So the first is measurable. When you read your drafted learning outcome, ask yourself, can I measure it? Can I measure this outcome? And so you really want to focus on the first word in the outcome. You want to make sure it starts with a measurable action verb. You also want to make sure that measurable action verb is specific. Okay, is the measurable action verb concrete and specific? If you answer no to either of those questions, I want you to consider looking at a couple of resources to help you swap out that first word of your learning outcome and replace it with a measurable and specific action verb. So the main resource that I'm going to introduce you to is Bloom's taxonomy. And you can share in the chat if you have familiarity with Bloom's taxonomy. There are many websites that showcase this taxonomy. There are different graphics that display it. I'm using a graphic from Vanderbilt University, but if you like Bloom's taxonomy and you have a favorite graphic you want to share with folks, feel free to drop it in the chat. So for those that may not be as familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, this taxonomy was developed by Benjamin Bloom back in the 1950s. Okay, so we have a very rich body of evidence that it is an evidence-based resource for writing effective learning outcomes. But Benjamin was part of a larger research team. And what they did with this taxonomy was it was an opportunity to categorize end goals of a learning experience. And they really found that there were 6 different levels of learning that captured those end goals. Now, these levels of learning have been revised over the years, at least one time, but the current levels are the following, and that's what's in the pyramid. So remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. The reason that the graphic is in a pyramid is because Bloom intended for these levels to be in a hierarchical structure, meaning that the lowest level of learning was at the bottom, remember, and learning builds on itself, right? So the highest level of learning is at the top, create. What they also intended is that it would provide specific and measurable action verbs to help describe that learning, okay? So what I would encourage you to do is when you're looking if that first word of your learning outcome, is it a measurable action verb that's specific? If your answer is no, consider consulting Bloom's taxonomy and think about the level of learning that you think you're trying to achieve. Let's say the level of learning is close to remember. Then look at the right and ask yourself, do any of those action verbs listed describe what I'm really wanting learners to be able to do? So for example, if the level of learning connects to remember, you might go over to the right and be like, oh, list. I actually want them to be able to list guiding principles. So I'm going to swap out that first word with list, okay? And now you have a learning outcome that starts with a measurable specific action verb. So that's how we can use Bloom's taxonomy. We're going to work through some examples for some practice. But one caveat I want to share with you is that, and not many people know this, Bloom in that team, at that time, they actually developed 3 taxonomies, okay? They developed a cognitive, an affective, and a psychomotor taxonomy. What we know today as Bloom's taxonomy is the cognitive taxonomy, meaning that the levels of learning and the action verbs here really strongly connect with cognitive learning, or learning that connects with knowledge gains, all right? But if you're writing learning outcomes and you're trying to achieve more effective learning, which connects with feelings, so shifts in attitudes, beliefs, behavioral intentions, and a lot of us engage in work where that's the end goal, there's a different taxonomy that you may want to consider, and that's called Fink's taxonomy. I'm going to introduce you to that at the end of the webinar, okay? But for right now, we're going to use Bloom's taxonomy as a resource, and that's going to help us select a measurable and a specific action verb to start that learning outcome. Now, the other 3 guiding principles that I want to share before we get to our examples, we want to check that the outcome is learner-centered. So now you're looking at the entire statement and you're asking yourself, does it articulate what I want learners to do by the end of the learning experience? If you've worked through the how-to guide, like 95% of the time, the statement you've drafted is learner-centered because you've already put yourself in the role of the learner, okay? Is it concise? We'll work through a couple of examples where I'm going to give you some statements that aren't so concise. And I'll give you some red flags to look for to help you distinguish between a lengthy learning outcome and one that we can revise to maybe make it more concise. And then lastly, aligned with situational factors. So again, it's not a single word, it's a phrase, but the last guiding principle that I would encourage you to consider is give the statement a final review. After you've checked the previous 4 boxes, go back to those situational factors and ask yourself, is the outcome realistic and achievable given the identified logistics? Remember, a couple of you, those are the words you use to describe an effective learning outcome. So those situational factors are going to help us with that. Does the outcome consider expectations of key stakeholders? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't, do you care or do you want to change it? Does the outcome consider the identified learner characteristics? Again, it likely already does because we've already checked that it's learner-centered, but you can just give it a final review. Okay, so now we're going to work through a couple of examples. I have 5 examples, and we're going to kind of play a game. So I'm going to give you the drafted learning outcome. The first 3 examples are from our case study, okay? I want you to identify the principle that we could strengthen. So the principle is going to be one of the 5 phrases or words on the left. So if you want to drop that principle in the chat, feel free to do so. There might be more than one principle that we can strengthen, but for each example, I just want to highlight one of the principles to kind of help walk you through the revision process. You can also just think to yourself if you're more comfortable with that. All right, so I'm going to pull up the chat so I can see your thoughts. But this is our first drafted learning outcome from our case study. So understand the key principles of effective harm reduction for campus communities. So tell me in the chat, is there a principle that you think we could strengthen to revise and rewrite this learning outcome? So any thoughts? All right, so I'm going to get us started with our first. Oh, Kate said specific. Awesome, Kate, strong work. So that is my analysis too, okay? And again, a couple different things we could work on here, but I think specific to me is the biggest red flag. So understand is actually a measurable action verb, but it's often too vague for assessment. And so understand, we tend to, when we draft learning outcomes, it's very easy and quite logical that we have this tendency to start with understand, and that's totally fine. But think to yourself, if I go to measure that outcome, it can be a little too vague for that assessment, that evaluation measure. Fortunately, though, if we consult Bloom's taxonomy, understand is an entire level of learning. So there's lots of specific action verbs to the right that we could consult that can serve as nice alternatives, okay? So when I consulted Bloom's taxonomy, I came up with identify. So again, you could just think about, when I said the word understand, what do I really want them to do? And when you look at those example action verbs, I came up with identify. Oh, I want them to identify key principles, okay? So now we have a measurable, but also a much more specific action verb to start our learning outcome. Okay, let's go to our second learning outcome, know approaches for developing partnerships with key stakeholders that help build support for campus harm reduction initiatives. So again, there might be a couple principles that we could improve upon, but there's one that I want us to think about more specifically. So any thoughts? And again, no, like that's another common starter for a drafted learning outcome. I'll go ahead and share my analysis. So this is a little tricky, but no is not necessarily a measurable action verb, okay? So when you're thinking about if you use know a lot and drafting your learning outcomes, just ask yourself, like, what do I really want them to know regarding these approaches? Okay, what do I actually want them to be able to do? And as I started to reflect upon that, and you can go back to step 2, right? What is all the language that you used around developing partnerships? What I recognized is that all the language I used was that I really wanted them to be able to build those partnerships, right? And so maybe what they can do in the hour that I have with them is to discuss effective approaches. So no approaches, when I think about it, what do I really want them to do? I really want them to be able to discuss effective approaches so that when they go back to their campus community, they can maybe utilize those to help them develop these partnerships. Okay, so again, you could insert a lot of different alternatives here. I think the key is if you start with no, just really reflect on what does that mean to you? What do you really want them to be able to do? And use step 2 to help you come up with that language. Okay. Okay, here's our last learning outcome from our case study. And this is a little tricky. So use the strategic prevention framework to develop an action plan for implementing harm reduction strategies on your campus. So I'll give you a hint. Use is a measurable and specific action verb. So it's not one of those 2 guiding principles. So is there a guiding principle that you think we could strengthen here? Oh, I like Jenny just mentioned describe 2 approaches for the last one. That would also be great. Liz, yes, time frame. Okay, perfect. So when you look at this learning outcome and you check for alignment with the situational factor, so this is kind of what I was saying we'd come back to. The 1-hour conference setting is likely not going to allow us to achieve this outcome as written. So this might be a really beautiful long-term goal that you have for participants, but what can they do in the hour that you have with them that sets them up for achieving this long-term goal? Okay. So again, just think to yourself, like, well, what can they actually be doing in 1 hour? And you can go back to the work that you've been doing, go back to the, again, the language that you used in step 2. And you're really, in this example, I indicated that you're kind of putting forth this model, right? So maybe they could analyze a model by which campus partners effectively use the strategic prevention framework. And if they can analyze the model in an hour, that will be a building block that they can kind of work from when they get back to their community to then use the strategic prevention framework and work through a similar process that you did. Okay. Again, you could have come up with a couple of different ways to, I think, revise the learning outcome based upon what you want them to actually be able to do. But just check that it's realistic and attainable. Okay. And that's where I think the situational factors really help. At this point in time, for each of our drafted learning outcomes, you could go back and again, check alignment with the other situational factors. But this is just a common one that I see with 1 hour educational sessions. And so I wanted us to kind of think through it as an example here. Okay, I have 2 examples left in our time together, and then I'll take any questions. So we're going to pivot out of that case study, okay? And in a few minutes, I'll drop the file where all of the blue text that you saw is going to be in my example case study file. So you'll have access to that in just a minute. But I want to switch to thinking about programming for students. So educational programming for students. I want to show you 2 different learning outcomes that I've drafted that will help us apply these guiding principles. So in this case, let's pretend you're on step 3, okay? And here's the drafted learning outcome. Define and explain how BAC impacts individuals experiencing the good and not so good things associated with party experiences. So any thoughts on a guiding principle that we could enhance? Concise, yeah, perfect. So I think we can make additional improvements to what I have drafted with a little bit more time. But one of the things that is a red flag for me as we think about that concise principle is when a learning outcome starts with 2 action verbs. So if you see that, try to select the action verb that indicates the higher level of learning. All right. The reason for this is that it will help clarify your evaluation measures. Because oftentimes when we use two action verbs and we go to actually measure whether students can do this, they might be able to define, but they can't explain. However, if they can explain, they typically can define. So in this particular example, you could just pick the higher level, explain, and then you can, again, the rest is a little bit wordy with just this good, not so good. You could take some time to kind of use some additional language to make that a bit more concise if that was useful to you. Here's another example from Programming for Students. List factors that shape the party environment and explain party design strategies that support individuals maximizing the good things and avoiding the not so good things. And I will give you a hint. This is a principle that we've already discussed, but I wanted to show you how to, just another example of how you could strengthen it. So the principle is what we just discussed, concise, okay? So this is what I see more often to help strengthen this particular principle. If you spot that conjunction and it's like in the middle of the learning outcome, what I want you to think about is there an entire learning outcome before it and an entire learning outcome after it, okay? Oftentimes there is. If that's true, ask yourself, are these really two separate learning outcomes that I need to separate? If that's the case, we definitely want to separate them because that's going to strengthen your evaluation measures, right? If it's actually the same learning outcome, then that likely means that we're just being a little wordy and we just need to revise and write that statement more concisely. But in this particular case, list factors and explain party design strategies feel like two separate learning outcomes to me. So we can just, again, separate those. And then the second one, explain party design strategies. If we want to work on language to make that a bit more concise, we can. But I think for the most part, at least it helps to clarify those evaluation measures and make it a bit more concise and specific. Does that make sense? Okay. So the last example I want to share with you, and this is not necessarily an example for us to work through, but I just want to mention it before we close out, is Sphinx Taxonomy, which is the resource that I mentioned you could consult when you're coming up with measurable and specific action verbs. So this taxonomy is not as old as Bloom's. It was developed in the early 2000s by L.D. Fink, and it helps to support both cognitive and affective learning. So the graphic you'll commonly see to describe the taxonomy is on the right. There are 6 different levels of learning. Those levels of learning are underlined. So there's foundational knowledge, application, and integration. That helps support more cognitive focused learning. But there's also new kinds of learning, like the human dimension, where you learn about yourself and others, caring, where you develop new feelings, and learning how to learn, okay? So there is a really excellent PDF, I'll drop it in the chat in just a moment, that provides a table of measurable and specific action verbs that connect to each kind of learning in Fink's taxonomy. And his hypothesis is that when you're drafting a set of learning outcomes, the more kinds of learning that you can have represented in those outcomes, the idea is that there might be overlap and synergy, and a significant learning experience may occur for the learner, okay? Now that's a little deep for the work, some of the work that we're doing. I have been working on a research project that explores the use of Fink's taxonomy over the last couple of years. So this becomes a resource that you really get excited about and want to talk about further. Feel free to shoot me an email and I can connect with you to talk about it. But I just wanted to showcase how you can use this resource, and I'm going to drop in the chat in just a minute, because I think it can connect with some of the work that you all do, okay? Especially when you're drafting learning outcomes around shifts in attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. That caring category and that human dimension category could be really useful. So this is a screen grab from the worksheet. You can see the middle column are action verbs. Any of those action verbs are measurable, they're specific, and they help support learning that connects to that caring domain or that human dimension domain. So for example, I've highlighted 3 action verbs: share, commit, promote. And I've come up with 3 learning outcomes on the left, just to give you a little sense of how this resource leads to drafting a different kind of learning outcome than Bloom's taxonomy, okay? So by using this resource, I came up with share effective approaches for mental health promotion, promote awareness of fentanyl-related harms within your social group, commit to take action in a drug overdose situation. So again, it's just a different resource. Not a lot of folks know about Fink's taxonomy, but may be useful for you, and it just builds out that toolbox as another resource you can consult when you are revising those learning outcomes. Okay, so I will, while we wait for questions to come in, I will drop a few questions, or I'm sorry, a few resources in the chat. I'm also going to showcase one other resource, this how-to guide. I'll drop the editable form in the chat and the completed version. The other resource I would really encourage you to think about is Centers for Teaching and Learning. So at any institution of higher education, most of them have a Center for Teaching and Learning. They have a website that they populate with a lot of free resources, many of them connected to learning design, which leads to writing effective learning outcomes. So if you have an institution that you enjoy that Center for Teaching and Learning, feel free to access those resources there. Your own institution, if you have a Center for Teaching and Learning, those instructional designers, that's the title for the folks that have an expertise in this particular field, they may provide free consultations to help you draft those learning outcomes or polish them. So I know at Ohio State, every year I have 1 hour of free consultation that I can utilize from those instructional designers, okay? If you don't have this resource, feel free to think about how you can collaborate and connect with your colleagues and see if they'll help you look at a draft of something. The other sources you'll find in the slides are the sources that I've identified and referenced on each slide in this PowerPoint. And these are just some key takeaway messages to summarize today, and I'll take any questions. And Anthony, I'll go ahead and stop sharing while I drop those resources in the chat, because I know you have a couple of wrap-ups.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you, Dr. Downing, for sharing of yourself, and as I can see in the chat, what is some very exciting and new material for a lot of our attendees. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for just some final housekeeping slides while we wait for any questions that might come in. Again, if you have any questions for Dr. Downing today, please put them in the Q&A. Just a reminder of a few upcoming events. We do have our national meeting happening at the end of June. That's taking place June 25th through the 28th in Columbus, Ohio. We will have some virtual options available, and you can, learn more about registration by visiting the conference website. Additionally, we have a July webinar taking place on July 23rd and is titled Screen You on Campus, and is featuring Logan Davis and Amy Hourigan from the University of South Carolina. I am going to check and see. It does look like we don't have any questions, so I'm going to just go ahead and wrap up for today's session. Logan, I see you jump on. Do you have a question?
I had a question for Molly. She answered this a little bit, but common missteps you see people when making. I think you covered the one with using understand, but what are some common mistakes you see people make when doing learning outcomes that people can be mindful for and that you can answer in 45 seconds?
I think one of the biggest ones from reviewing is just not aligning to those situational factors. So sometimes we develop these really beautiful learning outcomes, but they're a bit too complex for the learning experience itself. And so I would just, that step of identifying situational factors is one that even some of my colleagues that design courses, as part of their faculty responsibilities, don't necessarily take the time to engage with. But there's a deep, deep body of literature around when we acknowledge those situational factors, we can design more meaningful learning experiences because we're really acknowledging the life situation of the learner and the setting in which they're engaged in that learning experience. Does that help, Logan?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. I think that's yeah, something that I would see very common and something easy that people can do to remedy.
Yeah, for sure.
And then you also have a question in the chat from Ahmed that he's very upset that you have let him use subpar learning outcomes up to this point.
That is not true. Ahmed is excellent at writing learning outcomes. You should give himself more credit.
Well, thank you again to Dr. Downing, and thank you again to all of our attendees. Just a reminder that today's session has been recorded, and you can expect to see it uploaded to our website within 3 business days, along with the shared resources. We hope to see everybody at the national meeting and in our upcoming webinar next month. Take care, everybody, and hope you have a great rest of your week.